It is Monday, August 20th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Mr. David Worley. A native of Jonesboro, Georgia, Mr. Worley is a well-known and successful attorney practicing in Atlanta at the law firm of Evangelista Worley. A long-time presence in Georgia Democratic politics, Mr. Worley came within 974 votes of ousting Newt Gingrich from Congress in 1990. He has also served as the chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party, as well as a member of the Democratic National Committee. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mr. Worley. Very, very glad to have you here.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if we could get started by telling me a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. You're a Jonesboro native? Spalding County?
I spent most of my childhood in Griffin and Jonesboro.
Okay.
My father's family moved to that part of Georgia in the 1820s. He was in the military when I was very young, so I was actually born in Germany, moved around Europe and the United States until his last posting at Fort McPherson in 1965. At which point we moved to Griffin. I went to elementary school in Griffin, and then sixth grade through high school in Jonesboro.
So, did you grow up in a politically active? You said the military was. I guess what I'm trying to ask you, what's the origins of your interest in politics? Did that start at a very early age?
My family was not active in politics, and not even particularly interested in politics. I just was always interested in history and government, and just developed an interest in politics and campaigns from an early age. My first exposure to people who were involved in politics when I was in high school, my homeroom teacher for several years became a good friend. Her mother was a woman named Dot Paget, who was the organizer of the peanut brigades that Georgians who went around Iowa and New Hampshire and other parts of the country in 1975 and 1976 campaigning for Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that exposure, was a big fan of President Carter's, candidate Carter's. And in fact, I went off to college in the fall of 1976 to New England at the height of the Carter campaign. And people in college quickly knew that I was from Georgia and just wanted to talk about Jimmy Carter a lot. So I kind of became a defender of him as a candidate. And that was my sort of first exposure to people in politics.
Had to sort of, were you Jimmy Carter's Georgia translator up in Massachusetts?
A little bit. I think people saw me as an ambassador for the Carter campaign, and I enjoyed that role.
So you attended Harvard University?
I did. I majored in government there. I wrote my thesis on contemporary Southern politics. Actually, my senior thesis was on race and class as competing cleavages in Southern politics, and used Georgia and South Carolina as case studies. I studied there. I had two people in the government department that were big influences on me. The first was an associate professor there named Bill Schneider, who later went on to be the senior political analyst at CNN.
That's right, okay.
And the other was a professor named Doug Price, who had been an expert on Southern politics and congressional politics, had written a book on the Negro in Florida politics. That was the title of it. So I spent a lot of time in college on American politics.
So, studying government, were you already thinking ahead to a political life, or was that preparation for law school later down the road?
Maybe a little of both.
Or were you just one of those people like me? You enjoyed a topic, and that's what you wanted to pursue. You wanted to study.
I really enjoyed the topic, and that's what I was interested in studying.
So you would have graduated Harvard around 1980,
right?
And what was your post college? What were your post college plans?
In the summer of 1980, in the spring of 1980, I was elected a delegate to the Democratic National Convention from my congressional district. I had actually been elected in 1978 to be a delegate from my congressional district to...
Now, was this in Georgia?
In Georgia.
Okay.
Yes, in Georgia. In 1978, I was elected to be a delegate to the Democratic Party National Midterm Conference in the late 70s and early 80s. The Democratic Party had midterm conferences in between the national nominating conventions.
Okay.
And so in 1978, I was elected from the 6th Congressional District to go to Memphis at that conference. Happened to meet a state senator there who I became friends with and am still friends with, who's now the senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin. So I had done that in 1980. I ran to be a delegate, was elected, went to the National Nominating Convention in New York that nominated Jimmy Carter for a second term. And that summer, I had spent several summers in college in Washington as an intern, first in 1978 for Sam Nunn, and then in 1979 for the House Select Committee on Committees, which was a special committee called the Patterson Committee that had been set up to examine the structure of committees in the House of Representatives. And while I was there, I had gotten to know Dawson Mathis, who was a congressman from Southwest Georgia. And he had offered me a job in his campaign, because in 1980 he was running for the United States Senate against Herman Talmadge in the Democratic primary. So in the summer of 1980, I worked on his campaign. I went to the National Convention in Washington. He lost, National Convention in New York, sorry. He lost, and when that campaign was over, he offered me a job in his office in Washington to help him basically wind down his office. So I went up to Washington, worked for him for 5-6 months, and then looked for another job. In March of that year, I went to work for Ellett, who was a Democratic representative from DeKalb County. My job in his office, half of my job was being the legislative assistant for a variety of issues, defense, foreign policy, agriculture, justice. There were some other issues, I think. And then half of my job was supervising the legislative correspondence that went to Ellett. I was the person who reviewed every letter before it went to him for his signature. And he was a very picky, detail-oriented person. So it was very good training in writing. At the end of about 18 months in his office, I went to law school at the University of Virginia.
So you were not with the congressman during the '84
No, I was
campaign.
not. I was in law school at that time. Obviously, I followed it very closely.
Oh, I'm sure,
and, was upset with the tenor of the Republican campaign that was waged against him and the result.
Right. So you were at University of Virginia Law School. Now, some law schools you specialize, others you don't. What were you hoping to get out of law school?
Well, I planned to be a litigator, We didn't really specialize in
Sure.
anything, but I had a view towards litigation, and that's what I did.
So, what made you, come back to Georgia or resettle?
Well, I had always planned to
You had.
come back to Georgia and practice law in Atlanta. When I worked for Ellett, Ellett had been a partner at Arnold Golden and Gregory
Right.
in Atlanta before he was elected to Congress. He was a protege of Ellis Arnold, who had been governor of Georgia in the 40s. Governor Arnold would occasionally come through Washington to say hi to Ellett. On occasion, I would take the governor out to lunch.
What was that
got
like?
to know him. He was a great storyteller and had been an extremely progressive governor for the time.
Oh, yeah.
He was just a very interesting person. And he was from Noonan, which was nearby where I lived. I had grown up in Griffin and Jonesboro. So it was great to know him. And he told me at the time, he knew I was going off to law school. He said, well, if you want to come back to Atlanta sometime, give me a call and we can talk about coming to my firm. And so in the sort of Christmas period of, it would have been 1982, in the fall of 82, I gave him a call. He told me to send him his resume, and I was hired as a summer associate at Arnold Golden and Gregory, and worked mostly on litigation matters. I worked there again in the summer of 1980. Well, that would have been the summer of 83. Worked there again for part of the summer of 1984. Was offered a job and started in the summer of 1985 at Arnold Golden and Gregory.
And so that marks the point where you're a full-time Georgian,
Right.
Again, back here. So, doing the background research, you become involved in organized labor issues in Georgia. When did that come about?
Well,
Would
that
have
happened
been later.
That happened later.
Okay.
In 1987,
Okay.
I had been involved in almost all of the campaigns that had been run against Newt Gingrich. I had seen Newt Gingrich up close, personal,
This is a good segue
in Washington.
then, yeah.
When I worked for Elliott Levitas, I didn't think very highly of him as my congressman.
Sure.
And so I'd worked in these other campaigns actually in the summer of 1978. The first campaign that I really got involved in was that of Virginia Shepard, who was the Democratic candidate who lost to Newt Gingrich the first time he was elected.
This was the year Jack Flint had retired.
Yes, Jack
Okay.
Flint had retired, and Virginia was running. I supported her, volunteered in her campaign, really liked her, and still do, and was very disappointed that she lost. So I had worked for other candidates, and aside from Virginia's campaign, the general theme of Democrats who were running against Newt Gingrich was, I'm just as conservative as Newt, but he's a jerk and I'm a nice guy, so you should vote for me. I didn't think that was a very inspiring message, but nonetheless, I had worked for those candidates. And in 1986, I was co-chair of the Democratic campaign of Crandall Bray, who ran against Gingrich unsuccessfully. And So after that, it didn't really seem like anyone was going to be stepping up to run against Gingrich. So in the middle of 1987, I left Arnold Goldman Gregory and ran. I started putting together a campaign to run for 88. I ran in 88, I ran in 90. In 1990, I had tremendous support in the campaign from people in organized labor, because labor unrest at Eastern Airlines was an extremely important issue in our district. The 6th district at that time stretched from essentially South Fulton and the Atlanta airport, south to Griffin, west to Carrollton, north to Cedartown and Rockmart, and over to Dallas. And Douglasville. And there were, by far, the largest employer in the district was the airline industry. There were 20,000 or so employees probably in the district at Delta. There were another 10 to 12,000 employees who worked at Eastern Airlines. And Eastern was going through a lot of strife. The company had been essentially taken over by an airline executive named Frank Lorenzo, who was extremely anti-union. The machinist union at Eastern was vehemently opposed to Lorenzo's practices. The machinist union wanted federal mediation of the situation at Eastern. And there was legislation in the House of Representatives to require the parties to mediate their disputes.
I think I see where this is going.
At the time, in 1989, Newt Gingrich became the House Minority Leader. Historically, Gingrich had always portrayed himself as the friend of the airline worker. He was on the House Transportation Committee, on the Aviation Subcommittee, touted himself as the great friend of the airline industry and airline workers. Well, in 1989, he opposed mediation of the strike. Legislation passed the House requiring mediation of the strike and passed the Senate. And actually the day before Thanksgiving in 1989, President Bush, then President Bush, vetoed that legislation. And Gingrich supported that veto. That created an enormous rift among airline workers in the district. Workers at Eastern were furious. Workers at Delta were very concerned that if this could happen in Eastern, it would happen to them next. So that became the largest local issue in that race in 1990. There was also a large national issue in that race, which is that at the same time all of this had been going on, Gingrich voted himself a $35,000 pay raise. Well, voting yourself a $35,000 pay raise, which was more than most people in your district made, at the same time tens or many thousands of workers were losing their jobs or faced the prospect of losing their jobs. At the same time the country was going into a recession, was an enormous issue as well. So I got to know a lot of people in the labor movement, in the machinist union and many other unions. And then after that campaign was over and I'd gone back to practicing law, I also ran in another race in 1992. But in early '94, at the time there were two union-side boutique labor law firms in Atlanta. And the senior partner at one of them died very unexpectedly. And I had made friends with a number of lawyers in the firm, and they reached out to me to see if I would be interested in coming to that firm, because I had a lot of contacts in the labor unions
Right,
in Atlanta,
right.
and I was a litigator, and so I decided to do that and practiced in that area of the law for a number of years.
I wonder if we could step back to your initial '88 campaign. And, you mentioned that you stepped up when Crandall Bray, I think floated a possibility, but then withdrew because he didn't think '88 would be a beneficial cycle for Democrats. And I was wondering, you went into that race, and you had a primary opponent of sorts. Let me see if I can. Gene Owens.
Right.
The AJC said of him, he had no relevant experience and little to say on the issues. But so how did you approach that primary, knowing that more likely than not you were going to come out of this primary and square off against Newt Gingrich, somebody you'd been watching for a number of years?
Well, from the beginning, we just ran the race as if the opponent was Newt Gingrich.
A general election campaign.
Yes, we ran a general election campaign from the very beginning. We tried to spend as little money as possible in the primary, which made for a closer primary than we would have liked. But the focus was on Gingrich, the issues, his voting record, issues relating to him in that primary, and made it through the primary, and then just continued to focus on Gingrich and his voting record and his representation of the 6th district.
So we've talked about the geography of the 6th district. Explain to me how as a Democrat you run a race in a district that has South Fulton, the South Metro area, very racially diverse, economically diverse, and with a considerable rural population as well, and I guess a burgeoning suburban population.
Right.
Yeah. How do you approach that race, or how did you approach that race as a Democrat who wanted to run as a progressive voice, I guess, for the 6th district?
The district was diverse, as you say. It was still, in 1980, at that time, still quite a few rural voters were reliably Democratic. There was a heavy African American population in South Fulton at the time. Less, just not as large, an African American population in Clayton County, Henry, Fayette County, as there is today.
Right.
But the sort of outlying areas of the district were still more Democratic than not. And we just, campaigned everywhere. There were 12 counties in the district. I went to all the places that I could. In those days, there were still local radio stations and local newspapers that were very good outlets for getting the message out. And spoke to a lot of civic clubs at the time.
The pancake circuit?
Those kinds of things. Tom Murphy, who was the Speaker of the House, longtime Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, was from Haralson County in the western part of the district in Bremen. He would have a lot of traditional, fish fry type events,
right.
Traditional Southern barbecues and fish fries, and so you'd campaign out in that part of the district. There were things like in Polk County, the Antioch Corn Boil, which was just a big corn boiling picnic.
Is what it sounds like.
There were plenty of opportunities to go out and campaign in the district. At that time, the labor presence in the district was significant. There were shift changes at Eastern Airlines and at the Ford plant in Hapeville. There was a very large Ford plant in Hapeville.
And that was a UAW?
A UAW
shop?
plant. There was also a UAW plant at Lakewood. So there were also at the time Northwest Airlines was operating here, so there were shift changes to do there. There was a lot of personal campaigning, and we didn't have the financial resources that the Gingrich campaign had, but we weren't uncompetitive.
Right.
So we just tried all those things and had a pretty consistent message to every part of the district.
What effect, if any, do you think the '88 presidential election had on your own campaign?
It had a very significant effect. Gingrich essentially tried to cast me as a clone of Michael Dukakis. Made a big point, as he had made in previous years, of asking whether I would be voting for the Democratic presidential candidate. And I said that I would, made no bones about that. But that seemed to have, it did have a significant effect. In that period of time, voting patterns were much different much different in midterm elections and presidential elections, and different than they are today. In those years, there was the casual voter who turned out in presidential years, but not in midterm elections, tended to be a Republican voter. Right now, I would say that casual voters who don't turn out in midterm elections but do turn out in presidential years tend to be Democratic voters.
Right.
Well, it was pretty much exactly reversed in that period of time, so that it was better to run for a Democrat to run in a midterm, in an off-year election, than in a presidential year. So in 1988, for example, I got about 76,000 votes, and Gingrich got that many votes, and then he got another 30,000, 40,000 votes that were those casual voters who were turning out.
Right.
In the off-year election, I pretty much got the same number of votes in 1990, but those additional voters were not turning out, either because they soured on Gingrich and didn't want to turn out to vote, or because it was an off-year election and they weren't turning out. So that I got roughly the same number of votes in both years. But in 1988, I got 41% of the total vote, and in 1990, I got 49.7% of the total vote. But the presidential year, getting back to the presidential year, Gingrich got 59% district-wide. George Bush got 69% district-wide. And looking at the results, Gingrich had run further behind George Bush than all but three incumbents in the country, three Republican incumbents in the country. And so that led me to think that there was still a significant opportunity to run against him in 1990.
So your '90 campaign is informed by voting patterns that you just laid out, and the sort of issues that Congressman Gingrich perhaps gift wrapped your campaign in that district with Eastern Airlines and the pay raise issue. I remember reading something. I think it was a big quote, in a clippings file, and it was Gingrich, "I should have come home more," or something. Is that something that you also tried to hammer home? Because at this point, Gingrich is in the leadership, which means he's not going to be in the district as much.
Well,
or was that just
frankly, the more he was home, the worse he did. So I'm not sure coming home would have helped much, but we did essentially make the point that he was not paying attention to the concerns of the district. Whether he was here or in Washington, it didn't really matter. He just wasn't focused on the issues that people were concerned about. The largest example, of course, Eastern Airlines. So a large part of our campaign was a populist message that he had forgotten where he was from, if he had ever really known it, and that we needed a representative who would be focused on the issues of concern to people in the district. And the campaign that he ran fit very well with the campaign, our campaign message, because he would send out glossy campaign mailers that would show the Capitol. It would show, a picture of the well of the House of Representatives, making the point that he was the minority whip, and it really fed into our message that he was out of touch.
He was the insider.
Exactly.
You were the
and
outsider.
we were the outsider. I was the outsider. And we conveyed that, the way we were able to convey that in 1990, we put all of our money into direct mail. We had no money for television. We had done a limited amount of television in 1988. We didn't do that in 1990. We ran one radio ad in 1990 in Haralson County in the radio station in Tom Murphy's district, because he had raised the money to pay for that. He thought it was important for me to be on radio in Haralson County, and we were happy to do that.
Right.
But everything else went into direct mail. And in fact, our direct mail won the award for the best direct mail in a campaign in that year. But all of the mail was focused on Newt Gingrich being out of touch with the voters, voting for the congressional pay raise. As minority leader or whip, he had a chauffeur and a limousine. So we hit those issues, and I think they were effective. He certainly reacted in all of the debates that we had that fall. And I think we had 10 or 11 debates around the district.
So he actually debated.
Yes, he
in district.
He has always seen himself as a master debater. He had always challenged his opponents to debate in each of the 12 counties in the district. I think we ended up having 11 debates. There was one county where we couldn't arrange a debate, and another where we debated twice. But but we did debate, and those were, in my opinion, very helpful for my campaign.
Sure.
And he tended to react very badly to the criticism that I was making.
Was it true that your campaign hired a limousine to drive around polling places or the district?
Well, on election day, our campaign manager did hire a limousine to, we had some, I think someone had given us some Newt Gingrich signs, and they put the signs in the limousine and just drove it around various parts of the district.
All good fun.
All good fun, yes.
So that race went to a recount.
Yes.
Tell me about the recount process, because I think there's still a congressional race up in Ohio right now that's still under a recount. What was your experience like?
Well, in those days, that was before anyone really knew what hanging chads were.
Right.
Which didn't really come up until 2000. But Georgia most of the counties in the district, as I recall, had punch card ballots. And so the recount simply required taking those ballots and running them through the machine again. It was not very complicated nor very likely to change the results. But we thought it was, obviously we were entitled to a recount by law.
Right.
And went through the process, and I think it changed 2 votes. So.
We're at a, maybe this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but I think it's on topic. You know, right now we're having a debate because we've had touch screen Diebold machines since 2002 or 2003, 2004.
2002.
2002. Yeah, and the discussion is, what's next? I think we probably both agree that we won't have the same touch screens in 2 or 4 years. Is going back, what's your view on paper ballots?
Well, I'm very familiar with that issue because since 2004 I've been the Democratic Party's representative on the state election board. And when I first went on the election board, we had 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, and now we have 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. So that's an issue that I followed very closely. And my own view is that we need to return to paper ballots counted by OptiScan machines because, 1, it's cheaper, considerably cheaper, and 2, it's just provides a method of accountability.
Right, because the paper ballots are still there.
Because the ballots are there. And 3, gives people a much greater sense of confidence in the election system. So I think the General Assembly, I hope that the General Assembly will move to paper ballots in the next session, in time for the 2020 election.
Of course, there's a case pending in Judge Totenberg's courtroom. It's sort of up in the air. What's your sense of what might come out of that?
Well, I'm actually, as a member of the state election board, I'm a defendant in that case.
Well then. That said,
I've learned that if you're a party in a case, it's really not a good thing to predict, what a judge might do.
Right.
But it's certainly an issue right now as to whether the state would be able to switch to paper ballots in time for the November election.
So speaking of the Democratic Party, what was your experience with the state party apparatus sort of while you were a candidate, 88, 90? What sort of interaction did you have with the state party, so-called?
We had a good interaction with the state party. We had a not so good interaction with the national party.
Now, was that the DCCC or was
that was the DCCC? Okay. Well, I really had 2 different experiences.
Okay.
In 1988, they were very encouraging, in large part because Newt Gingrich had been a thorn in the side of Jim Wright. He had attacked Jim Wright, who was the then Democratic Speaker of the House, and eventually, essentially forced him to resign. So Democrats in Washington were very interested in our race in 1988. Beryl Anthony, who was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, made a big effort to help raise money for the campaign, did. The committee at that time spent the maximum amount of what was known as, and I think still is known as 441 AD expenditures, coordinated expenditures, where the committee pays for television advertising or other advertising, which at the time the maximum would be about $50,000. So they put that money into the race, which would have been about 15% of the money that we raised. So they were very helpful. That changed in the fall of 1989, or December of 1989. I was running again. The House passed a $35,000 pay raise. It was widely reported in Washington that the Republican and Democratic leadership agreed that they would not help candidates who would make the pay raise a big issue. That didn't make any difference to me. And as soon as the pay raise was passed, and Gingrich had voted for it in, I think, December of 1989, I issued a press release, attacked him, got a good bit of coverage in the Washington Post at the time for being one of the first Democratic candidates to speak out on this issue. And as a result, the Congressional Campaign Committee did not provide any support in the 1990 race, except that very close to the end of the election, they sent a $5,000 contribution to Ed Jenkins, who was a Democratic congressman from North Georgia at the time, who didn't have much, if any, of a race. And he sent the money back to them and said, I don't need this money, why don't you help Dave Worley in his race? And so they made a $5,000 donation at that time. But otherwise, they didn't provide any assistance in 1990. And in a race that turned on 974 votes.
One of those what ifs.
Well, that's, that's a question that I've been asked in the past. So a very different experience in 1988 and 1990. I think, if I was looking at it very honestly, they probably didn't make the decision to help solely on the basis of the vote on the congressional pay raise or my criticism of the congressional pay raise. I think they probably made an assessment that there were other races that they thought were more winnable than ours, and that's why they didn't, in the end, that's why they didn't put the money in. Although we were telling them, that we had polling that indicated the race would be very close.
Now, you mentioned the state party. What kind of resources was the state Democratic Party able to offer the campaign?
In those days, the state Democratic Party really didn't offer much in the way of financial assistance to at least to federal candidates. They were focused more on Democratic candidates for state office.
And that was a gubernatorial. That was the Miller-Isaacson race.
Yes, that was when Zell Miller was elected, and that was the major focus of the state party. Would have been the Miller race.
Right. So 91 rolls around. That's a redistricting year. What effect did the redistricting process have on your political prospects? Because you mentioned you ran in 92.
I did run in 92.
In a different district.
Yeah, in much of the same district.
Different number.
Different number. The district number was changed to the 3rd district. What happened in 1991, and I followed the redistricting process quite carefully, attended meetings, committee meetings and various things, watched the process, talked, or, just followed the process. Georgia got one additional congressional seat after the 1990 census. Most of the growth had been on the north side of Atlanta, most of that additional growth. And the legislature made, I think, Democrats in the legislature made a very reasonable decision that they should take Republican voters out of the districts of Democratic congressmen on the north side. That would have been Buddy Darden,
Mm-hmm.
Ed Jenkins, and Ben Jones, and make a heavily Republican district, concede that district to the Republicans, but save those 3 Democratic districts. And so that's what was done. A district that was centered on East Cobb, North Fulton, North DeKalb was created, and part of Gwinnett was created. And I don't think anyone really expected that Newt Gingrich would just completely pull up stakes and move to that district, none of which he'd ever represented before, and run there, but that is what he did. The district that had most of the previous 6th district was renumbered the 3rd district. It stretched from West Georgia over to Milledgeville and down to down to Crawford County, near Roberta, Georgia, and down to Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
About 75% of the voters in that district had been in the old 6th district.
Okay.
25% of the voters were from the old 3rd district. There was a Democratic congressman, Richard Ray, from that district, who was very conservative, very conservative Democrat. I had about 75% of the voters. He had about 75% of the money. And there were 4 candidates in the Democratic primary. So our goal was to make it into a runoff, essentially.
Right.
At the time, this was on the heels of the House banking scandal, and there were Democratic incumbents being all over the state being challenged by candidates who were taking advantage of the anti-incumbent tenor of that period. That's when Sanford Bishop beat Charles Hatcher in what was the old 2nd district. Ben Jones, it turned out, lost that year to Don Johnson. So there was a lot of ferment and unrest directed towards the House of Representatives. So I was hopeful that if I made the runoff, we would win. Made the runoff against Richard Ray, we would win. I would win. And he got about 50.1% of the vote. And we missed making the runoff by about 400 some votes. So that was the 1992 campaign. Then in the fall, he did not run very well in the parts of the district that I had campaigned in before, and lost to Mac Collins.
Right. Now, did you endorse or campaign for Congressman Ray, or was that?
I did not.
What was your decision-making process?
Well, I really wasn't asked to until the last week of the campaign. He called me up and asked me to appear at an event in Clayton County with him, and I did not. I don't know that looking back on it, I don't know if I had a conflict or if there was some reason I couldn't be there, but I just did not get involved in that race.
I would assume he had seen the internal polling or something that suggested that he was weaker in Clayton County, which would have been a more staunchly Republican area of that 3rd district.
It was Fayette and Clayton were the most Republican parts of that district. Fayette more so, but.
So you mentioned after '92, that's when you really get involved, and your law firm
Mm-hmm.
that you were working at. So, what leads you to get sort of dragooned into becoming the chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party? Did you go willingly, or was that
Well, no,
something you sought out?
I did.
Okay.
I didn't seek it out, but when I was asked, I answered the call. In 1998, Roy Barnes was the Democratic nominee for governor, and the tradition in the Democratic Party at that time was, because we had not had a Republican governor for 130 years, the tradition was that the Democratic nominee for governor would pick the state party chairman, who would help on the fall campaign, and do that by, we would have a state convention every 4 years. The candidate, all the statewide candidates would formally accept their nomination, and the gubernatorial nominee would make a recommendation to the convention as to who the state party chair should be, and they'd be elected, essentially rubber stamped at that convention. So I had known Roy Barnes for a long time, thought he was a great candidate, had in 1998, just had been very involved in his campaign and fundraising and other things for his campaign. His campaign manager and later chief of staff, Bobby Kahn, we had gotten to be friends at the Democratic Convention in 1980, where I had been a delegate and Bobby had been the official page for the Georgia delegation. We were the same age. We were gotten to be friends and had remained friends. And he thought that given my previous experience, that I'd be a good candidate to sort of help unify the Democratic Party activists to the extent that they needed to be unified, and suggested that to Roy, and Roy thought that was a good idea and recommended me to the convention, and I became chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party.
What did you discover when you get to your, I don't know, offices, or once you get into office as chairman, what did you learn about the party apparatus or organization that maybe you didn't know, or what was the state of the party as you found it?
We had, this was 1998, we had fairly active Democratic parties in many of the counties around the state, but they had never really been, nor had the state party really been required to do a whole lot to support Democratic candidates. I mean, Georgia at the time was a majority Democratic state. While Republican candidates had won at the state level, there'd been a very limited number of statewide elected Republican candidates, although they were waging very competitive races in the 1990s. But the state party itself, I think, had never been an entirely professional organization. And so our goal was to turn it into an organization that could really help Democratic candidates, that would have a professional staff. And so that's what we focused on. In 1998, we had a very active coordinated campaign run out of the offices of the State Democratic Party, and raised a lot of money for the coordinated campaign, continued to raise a lot of money for the state party, which is not difficult to do when you have a governor of your own party. So I think by the time I left as chairman in the fall of 2001, we had a staff, I think, of 16, and they were extremely professional, very competent, very well organized, and able, for the first time, I think, to help large numbers of candidates for the State House and the State Senate, which we did in 2000 and 2001, and 2002.
So 98 is your first election cycle as chairman, and of course Governor Barnes wins against Guy Milner in his last statewide race. Michael Thurman wins as Labor Secretary, Thurber Baker, Attorney General.
Kathy Cox. And Mark Taylor as Lieutenant Governor.
Right. But at the same time, Paul Coverdell, who was senator at the time, was able to defeat Michael Coles, a very well-funded businessman. Why do you think Paul Coverdell was successful while statewide Democrats were really probably the most successful election for Democrats, I guess, the last
20 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
We won't be too coy there.
Well, that's a very good question. I think several of those candidates had, in fact, I think all but one of those candidates, Mark Taylor, had been in office already, either by appointment or
that's right.
Or well, I guess actually Mike Thurman was elected in his own right. Thurber Baker and Kathy Cox had been appointed to fill those offices, so they were running as incumbents, which was quite helpful. Paul Coverdell was the incumbent.
Sure.
And Michael Coles, who had run in the 6th District in 1996 against Newt Gingrich, I think was still something of an unknown or a less known quality to people. So I don't think there's much more answer than that. Paul Coverdell was known and well liked, and at that time, still elections weren't so nationalized as they are today. That is, partisan, feeling was not as great. While Coverdell was a Republican, I think there were a number of people who obviously there were a number of people who voted for other Democratic candidates at the state level who were voting for him because they just thought he, had done a good job as a United States Senator for 6 years.
Speaking of Senator Coverdell, he passed away very suddenly, July 2000, and it fell to Governor Barnes to appoint his successor. You were chairman of the party. Were you involved in the conversations surrounding that?
Only to the extent, not to the extent of well, let me think back. I think everyone at that level, at that time, thought that Zell Miller would be the best candidate to run. And I certainly agreed with that at the time. But participating beyond that in the decision to nominate or to select him and appoint him, no, I participated very actively in the campaign that fall to get him elected.
So, as chairman, so most of your energy, time, resources would have been, helping to elect Governor Miller against, I guess, Mac Mattingly would have been Senator Mattingly.
That and the 2000 presidential campaign.
Right, the Gore versus Bush, back when the Democratic Party still poured resources into Georgia. Redistricting is a topic that comes up. The 2001 redistricting especially comes up a lot in these conversations. What sort of input does the Democratic Party chairman have in the redistricting process?
Well, we actually, the state party, actually played a very large role in that redistricting because we spent the money to get the software that was necessary to come up with maps that would help Democratic candidates. We all, that is Governor Barnes, his chief of staff, me, the executive director of the state party at the time, who was John Karinchak, and the staff of the Democratic Party at the time, realized that Republicans were doing much better in the elections, and that while in previous redistrictings many factors were involved in drawing the lines, that is, a state representative might think that he had more friends in this city than that city, or this county than that city, and than that county, that you could look at the numbers and you could use software and you could really tell how to best draw lines to advantage your party's candidates.
Right.
And so we had a number of people on the staff of the Democratic Party who spent months coming up with a variety of maps, options, providing them to the governor and his staff, and talking with Democratic representatives and senators about the best maps possible to help them get reelected. So that had never been done up to that point in time, and so the party apparatus, such as it was, the staff played a very large role in providing Democrats options to use. Now, of course, those Democratic representatives and senators had to, negotiate with their colleagues and sort of carry the ball.
Mm-hmm.
The staff of the state party didn't have any votes on anything.
Right.
But it was the major focus of our efforts for all of 2011 or 2001.
You mentioned earlier that you resigned as state party chair in 2001 to sort of jump back into the
yes.
Congress. How had campaigning changed?
It had changed
in that decade.
Oh, it had changed remarkably. What happened in 2001, after the 2000 census, Georgia got 2 more congressional seats, new congressional seats, and I, had always wanted to be a member of the House of Representatives, and thought that if one of those districts, one of the new districts covered my home, that I would look very seriously at running. And it turned out that one of the new districts did do that. And so I resigned as party chair and ran for that seat. But it was a very different era, because whereas in 1990, I would go speak to the Carrollton Rotary Club or the Griffin Kiwanis Club, and go talk to local radio stations and local newspapers, and spent a great deal of time actually doing the kinds of retail politics,
yeah.
yes, that is really the enjoyable thing about campaigning. By 2002, that had changed greatly, in that well, just to digress, there were fewer radio stations and there were fewer newspapers because they had just been going out of business. But the cost of running a campaign had gone up orders of magnitude. Well, maybe not orders of magnitude, but let's say in 1988 and 1990, you could run an entire campaign, or we did run entire campaigns for around $450,000. By 2002, that had gone up. Doubled at least. And the primary campaign in 2000, I think we raised roughly $800,000 in 2002. So, so in that race, I spent most of my time sitting in a room calling people for money. And we were very successful at raising money, but that's not the kind of campaign that we had run before, or that personally I would like to run. But that was necessary to raise the dollars that were required.
Is that because television expenditures have become such a central part of campaigning?
Yes,
anymore?
they have, and that's a large part of that.
As you mentioned, you still remain active in Democratic politics. Tell me about when were you a voting member of the DNC?
Well, I first became a voting member of the DNC in 1998.
Okay.
Because
as a chairman,
as party chairs and party vice chairs are automatically members of the Democratic National Committee, state party chairs and vice chair. So I was a member from '98 until 2001, and then I was again. Then I ran at the state level. Was elected by the state Democratic Party in 2004. No, that's not right. In 2008 to a term that began. The terms begin on the last day of the day after the last day of the Democratic Convention, National Convention, and run for 4 years. So I served 2 terms after that, from 2008 to 2016.
I wonder if we could just zoom out a bit and get your analysis of Georgia politics and how it's changed over the last few decades. Why were Georgia Democrats able to hold on to power so long, even as other southern states were electing Republican governors, Republican senators, Republican legislatures? What made Georgia different in your estimation?
It wasn't the fact that I was chairman of the Democratic Party, much as one would like to think that. That's a very good question because, and I'm not sure that I know the answer. In fact, I'm probably sure I don't know the answer, but it is true that Democrats in Georgia were able to hold the governorship and other offices for a much longer period of time than in other southern states, particularly states in the Mid-South, but even other states in the Deep South. And I think part of it was very talented Democratic candidates for governor and for the United States Senate. When Sam Nunn was elected in 1972, he could easily have lost that race, but he was an extremely effective senator and a very good politician, and served for 24 years, so that kept Republicans out of that office, at least for that
Never
period
a
of time.
significant challenge,
No.
except for Fletcher Thompson
Right,
in
exactly.
72.
So we had very talented people occupying these offices. The other Senate seat, Senator Talmadge lost in 1980 after a very contested Democratic primary. Still barely lost that race. And then in 1986, we had another extremely talented Democratic candidate in Weich Fowler running. And so he was able to keep that seat. But for the fact that he was required to be in a runoff in 1992, he would have won in 1992 as well. And then we had gubernatorial candidates who were just very talented people. Zell Miller in 1990, and Roy Barnes in 1998. And then Max Cleland, who was also a proven candidate. So we had particularly good Democratic candidates, and we had Republican candidates that really weren't that great, in Guy Milner, for instance. So those personal factors make a difference and have an impact. Also, Georgia has a significantly higher African American percentage of voters than other southern states at the time. That certainly made a difference, and we had very talented African American candidates who could help, or who were part of a ticket that would appeal to a wide variety of voters, Democratic voters. In 1998, for instance, we had Roy Barnes, who was perceived as a moderate to conservative Democrat.
Right.
We had two major African American candidates. We had a woman in Kathy Cox, Secretary of State. We had candidates from all parts of the state, Atlanta, Southwest Georgia. So we had very talented people, and I think that made a difference.
Well, you mentioned Sam Nunn, Herman Talmadge. These were people who had run as Georgia Democrats, or a Sam Nunn Democrat or something like that. Is there a distinction between Georgia Democrats and Democrats today in Georgia? Does that distinction mean anything?
No, I don't think that distinction means anything today. I think Democrats who are running for statewide office in Georgia today are, in some cases, more moderate than national Democrats, or Democrats running in other parts of the country, I should say. But there's not the difference that there was in the 1970s and 1980s.
How do you think the Democratic Party has changed here in Georgia since you became involved back in the days of Jimmy Carter and Dawson Mathis? How has the party changed, either politically, demographically?
Well, I think you have to first think about what you really mean by the Democratic Party.
Sure.
I think there's sometimes a perception that there was or is a very organized Democratic Party. There's really not, and there really never has been to a large degree. We have 159 counties.
Mm-hmm.
We have party organizations in most of those counties. But really until the late 90s, there was not a really well-organized Democratic Party. And even when there was, in the, let's say, the late 90s, that was a structure in Atlanta that helped the Democratic candidates around the state, not necessarily by organizing Democrats out in all the 159 counties, but by using the sort of unique qualities, legal qualities that it had to raise money and spend it on behalf of Democratic candidates. The real thing, the real advantage that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party would have as an organization is, under Georgia law, it can raise an unlimited amount of money. And it can spend an unlimited amount of money on behalf of candidates as long as it's spending on behalf of essentially more than one candidate. If you're spending money on behalf of a slate of candidates, there's really no limit on the amount of money that you can spend. So that was the real value that the state Democratic Party could add to campaigns, was this ability to spend money, to raise large sums of money that candidates couldn't raise because they were limited, and spend it on behalf of those candidates. And that was true before the late 90s. I'm not sure to what extent the party really took advantage of that prior to that, but we saw that was the landscape, and that could be done, and did it. And as far as as far as what is the Democratic Party, I mean, the Democratic Party is essentially the candidates who run under the Democratic banner. And those candidates are really the ones who are organizing volunteers and voters and getting a message out to people. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No. I think that's fine, because what I was thinking about from that is we've talked about people like Jack Flint, Richard Ray, Ed Jenkins, who the backbone of their constituency were rural conservative whites, which were the most reliably Democratic voters.
After African American voters.
Right. Even more so. African American voters as the reliable constituency of Democrats. What happened to that sort of rural white constituency? Why did they leave the Democratic Party when they did?
Well, actually, the thesis that I wrote in college was about the sort of three historically competing groups of voters in Southern politics.
Okay.
And historically, there were affluent whites, poorer whites, and African American voters. And how those three groups combined to support different candidates told how elections would end in Southern politics. Now, for a long time, those three groups operated within the Democratic Party primary.
Right.
So that you would have, say in 1970, you would have African American voters, historically mostly in the cities, and because they had not been able to vote in great numbers in rural areas, but African American voters and affluent white voters supporting Carl Sanders, and less affluent white voters supporting Jimmy Carter in the Democratic primary. In 1968 was kind of a perfect storm to show where those voters were, because black voters supported Hubert Humphrey, poor white voters supported George Wallace, and affluent white voters supported Richard Nixon. So you could compare those results with results in later elections and get a good idea of how voters were combining to support different candidates. The sort of goal of, or the sort of hoped for goal of political scientists in that period of time was that Southern politics, where you essentially had a one-party democratic system, would eventually come to resemble New Deal politics
Right.
in the rest of the country, where you would have affluent voters supporting Republicans and less affluent voters, black and white, supporting Democrats.
The V.O. Key
Exactly.
thesis, the Key Woodward
Exactly.
thesis.
And by the time of the late 70s, when I wrote my thesis, it seemed that was happening. You were having progressive candidates, Southern candidates in South Carolina, really all throughout the South, where less affluent voters were supporting Democrats and more affluent voters were supporting Republicans. Well, Ronald Reagan comes along in 1980 and blows that all to hell. He starts his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and sends a very clear signal that he is going to continue the Southern strategy that the Nixon campaign had developed in 1972, and subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, appeal to less affluent voters on the basis of race. And that has been the reason that the Republican Party, the main reason that the Republican Party has done better in rural white area, in rural parts of the South, including Georgia. And you can look at the voting patterns today and see the same patterns replicated over the last 40 years. So I don't think, while there are a number of reasons that for the rise of the Republican Party in Georgia, increasing affluence, and they're appealing to affluent voters. So
Sure.
The more affluent the state becomes, to some degree, the more Republican it becomes. But you can't see how Republicans have done as well as they have in the South and in Georgia without realizing that race is a central issue and has always been a central issue in Southern politics.
A slight departure, but your take on Donald Trump, the Trump presidency, historic for any number of reasons. What do you think, in terms of Georgia politics, the sort of short and long term effect of a Trump presidency is going to be on sort of the Republican Party here in Georgia? Because as you mentioned, rural, working class, less affluent white voters tend to be President Trump's strongest supporters, whereas voters in those traditionally Republican areas, say the 6th District, for example, in the suburbs, have demonstrated some level of wariness to the president and his brand of politics. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you described that very well. Well, I think there are a number of things going on. I think one of the things that has gone on is that Democrats in the last dozen years or so have not adequately responded to the concerns of a great many working class voters. There has not been enough focus in the last 10 years on jobs,
right,
on making sure that people have good, middle-class, well-paying jobs. And that failure on the part of Democrats has left an opening for the Republicans to raise issues like immigration and trade, which at heart are a reflection of voters' concerns with the lack of good-paying jobs. And I think an example of that was the Nunn-Purdue race 4 years ago, where the Democratic candidate hit David for Perdue for shipping jobs overseas, which I think is a correct argument to make, but it has less resonance because Democrats can't really point to instances of things that they've done on the trade issue to keep jobs here or to do other things to foster economic growth directly. So one, I think there's been a failure on the part of the Democrats, of Democrats. Two, Republicans have walked into that, and Donald Trump walked very successfully into that opening and took advantage of that, so that he has conveyed this impression, which is entirely wrong, that he really cares something about working class voters, because his policies are anything but helpful to working class voters in the short term or the long term. So I don't know whether he can sustain that appeal to voters. I think his tax policy is entirely geared towards benefiting very wealthy voters, not even moderately wealthy voters, but very wealthy voters. And I think over time, I hope people will come to realize that. And he has an economic policy that's just not sustainable and that's not going to benefit those working class voters in the long run. So, whether he can maintain that appeal is an open question to me. At the same time, affluent voters, think he's an idiot and are just repelled by his personal behavior and some of his policy positions, but I think mostly his manner and his personal behavior. I don't know. There has always been this tremendous tension in the Republican Party nationally and here in the South between appealing to less affluent voters on social issues and more affluent voters on economic issues, because those two things don't fit at all together. Those two wings of the Republican Party don't fit, and I don't know how successful the Republican Party can be in maintaining that sort of tension. I mean, that's I think the reason they don't win the popular vote nationally, because you can't really appeal for very long to both of those wings of the party. And I think that a good Democratic candidate who's in 2000, who's a nice, normal person, not Donald Trump, who can talk about economic issues, pocketbook issues, will be able to divide the Republican Party enough to win.
Well, that's a good segue in the question about Republicans here in Georgia. In office, governor's office since 2003, state government since 2004, 2005. What's the biggest threat to the Republican Party's ongoing control of Georgia government?
Well, I think it's their inability to deal with the problems that face average voters in the state. They have radically defunded education in the last 12 years. They're not doing anything on the healthcare front. So I think, and they I mean, the three major issues after law enforcement that the state faces and that are part of the state's budget are education, healthcare, and transportation. And the Republicans at the state level and in the General Assembly are doing nothing to deal with the issues, with those issues that concern people in their everyday lives. People want some rational transit system. They want education to be well funded, and there are parts of the state where, you know, if you live where I do in Fayette County, we have a wonderful public education system,
Right.
And it's well funded locally. But there are many, many other parts of the state that don't have the resources that we do in Fayette County, and Republicans have done nothing other than talk about charter schools, which will help a very small fraction of students to deal with that issue. And healthcare, I mean, to have walked away from billions of dollars in federal taxes that we have already paid and not use that money to fund Medicaid around the state, and particularly to save our rural health systems, is an act of conscious neglect that is just unbelievable. So I think the biggest threat to the Republican Party is the fact that Republicans are just not dealing with the problems of the state. And sooner or later, we'll have a Democratic candidate instead of Democratic candidates, and we have some excellent candidates running in 2018 that will be able to take advantage of that.
What about demographics? That's something that always comes up. And it's sort of always been the great hope of Democratic activists, Democratic candidates, that eventually someday the demographics are going to favor Democratic candidates. Are we on the cusp of that? Has that already happened in some places and not others?
Well, if demographics were destiny, Mississippi would be the most democratic state in the country, and it's not. The truth of the matter is that the demographics in the state are changing in a way that in some way will help the Democratic Party. But I don't think we can sort of sit on our hands and wait for demographic change to elect Democratic candidates. I think that Democrats need to appeal to everyone, to convince people that have not been voting Democratic why a Democratic ballot is a better choice for them. And I think there are issues on which that argument can be made. And so if there are two kinds of Democrats now in Georgia today, one who says, well, we just need to turn out everyone who looks like us, or everyone who agrees with us, and another group of Democrats that says we need to make a better argument and appeal to everyone, because most people in this state, if they really think about the issues, will agree with us. I'm in the latter camp, that we need to make a better argument. We've got the issues. If you really take the time to convince people, most Georgians would agree that Democratic policies are better for them in their everyday lives. And that case just has to be made, and it has to be made at the state level and the national level.
Is it being made in 2018?
So
far? We're early in the general election, so it's not Labor Day yet.
I think it will be made by a lot of the candidates, and I think Stacey Abrams, although reading the media, many people will say that, well, she's gearing her campaign towards turning out people who already agree with her. I think if you really look at what she's talking about and the issues that she's talking about, she is talking about the issues, education and healthcare, and other issues that really appeal to everyone. And the Republican candidates are running just an attack campaign that doesn't really focus on the issues. And I think you've seen since the Republican primary that her real focus has been on issues, and Brian Kemp's has not.
Is there going to be the vaunted blue wave in November?
I think, yes, in Georgia. I think from what I've seen in talking to candidates and sort of getting around the state a little bit, we have a very talented crop of Democratic candidates who are running for the State House and the State Senate in competitive seats, in seats that are competitive this year, haven't been competitive in the past, haven't in some cases even been contested in the past. But there are a great number of Democratic candidates for the State House and for the State Senate who are running in East Cobb, North Fulton, North DeKalb, Gwinnett, Henry County, other parts of the state who are going to be elected. I think there's going to be enough of a wave for Democrats to pick up 10 or 12 House seats and at least 2 Senate seats. So I think for Democrats this will be the best year for General Assembly candidates since 1998 or 2000.
And the irony there, of course, with the places you just listed, East Cobb, North Fulton County, North DeKalb, Gwinnett, the modern Republican Party emerged from those areas.
Exactly, and those are the kinds of people, those affluent suburban Republicans, who are being most repelled by Donald Trump, and I think they're going to be voting for Democratic candidates, or they're going to be staying home.
So what's next for Mr. David Worley in terms of politics?
I don't see myself running for public office again. I enjoyed the experience. The best thing about running a losing congressional race is that you meet lots and lots of wonderful people. You make a lot of friends, and you get an opportunity to talk to people about the issues that concern you and that concern them. But I don't see me doing that. I've been there, I've done that. It was a great experience, but I think it's time for other people to do that now.
Well, thank you for being here and doing this. And on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library, thank you very much for participating. Really did enjoy it. Thank you very much,
welcome,
sir.
Ashton. So did I. Thank you.